Good morning, everybody. What I'm going to try and do this morning is give you a presentation about what's happening at a European level. So I'm going to start with statistics that have come out in an annual report that we published to compare industrial productivity results in the European Union. So I can hardly avoid using Mark Twain's famous expression, who said that in the category of lies, there are three different categories of lies. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics.
So voy a presentar algunas.
But despite that, I'm going to give us some statistics, not very many statistics, but it'll give you an idea about the situation of the different member states within the EU and how they're doing. So firstly, this table is quite an interesting one because it gives us three different groups of EU countries. The first of these groups This first group are sort of the original EU countries. That is, all of those countries that were already the EU before 2004. Of course, Spain is within that group, and the vast majority of what we call the older EU countries. Why are they separated from the rest of the countries? Well, because the data that we have show that they've got consistent results. What that means is that they've got good results over time. Then we've got another group of countries here in blue, group 2. And in this group, you've got some older EU member states, such as Italy, but also some more recent EU states. And these countries that show moderate industrial results, perhaps less good than in group 1. And then finally we've got group 3 here in red, and there you've got the vast majority of new EU members. So we're talking here about three different groups. And when I divide them into three groups, we're going to have group 1, which is countries with consistent results, group 2, those with moderate results, and in third place, a group of countries that are catching up to the EU average. So basically, what have we seen in these groups of countries? What do statistics show us? Well, firstly, labour productivity in the EU is growing and has been growing since 2007. There are some exceptions to this rule that I'll mention later on, but basically, labour productivity is on the increase. However, because of the financial crisis, we need to admit that the workforce is actually also going down, in fact, more quickly than production. As for the first group of countries, those countries that we've called the consistent group, in this group, productivity is higher, and we can find very consistent results in several countries such as Ireland, the Netherlands, Austria, and Belgium. But in general, the member states in group 1 are above the EU average, and that includes Spain. As for group 2, this is an interesting group because it's below the EU average, and yet there's also a tendency in this group to improve, with one exception, which is Italy. And I'll explain a little bit more about Italy later on. Finally, for group 3, that's the grouping that has new member states within it, these countries are still below the EU average. However, once again, they are improving, and quite visibly. Why? Well, because they've shown that they are really very able to attract overseas investment, and also because they've invested heavily in infrastructures. For example, this is the case of Lithuania and Latvia. Another important thing is, for this group of countries, that employees are highly skilled. And this is, once again, the case of Lithuania and Latvia. And actually, let's now go on and talk about skills. Here, once again, in this table, we've got the 3 groups of countries. And what you can see quite clearly here is that the vast majority of countries, if we're looking at the percentage of people who are highly skilled, there's an increase in almost all countries. The average here is more or less 20%. So why do we insist so much on this issue of the fact that European industry requires highly skilled workers? Well, basically because in almost all the industrial sectors where there's work, what is necessary is for there a need to be new technologies have to be included, firstly, and also the products that the EU needs to sell are, of course, what we call advanced products. And when we say advanced, what we mean are their technological content, or because they're products that are very creative, or they require a great deal of know-how. Because what are we talking here about at the end of the day? We're talking here about finding market niches throughout the world. And if we want to compete on a world level, if we want to be globally competitive, then technology and advanced products are key. What this annual report also recognizes, this annual report that we produce on industrial results in the EU, is the fact that if you want to carry on being competitiveness on the world stage, then you need to be continually upskilled. Let's look a little bit more in detail about what we mean when we say high skilled. In the table that you saw earlier, there were 3 clear leading countries: Ireland, Spain, and Finland. In these countries, the percentage of highly skilled workers is notable. And another common trait in almost all the EU member states is the fact that people are more highly skilled today than they were back in 2006. Let's now look at the countries in Group 2, what we call the group with moderate industrial results. Here, there's a clear diagnosis that we can make for this group of countries. These are countries that have labor-intensive industries. Also, the innovation level is fairly low, and the skills level of the workers in these countries also fairly low. Italy is a clear and perhaps dramatic example of this Group 2 countries. Why do I say that? Because there's a complete lack of adaptation of qualifications, a complete skills mismatch in Italy, and also because there's a relationship between the fact that the percentage of people with tertiary education, that's after leaving school, is fairly low in the 30 to 34 age group. This indicates that Italy hasn't actually made the effort that was necessary during the beginning of the 21st century, and this is something that it's going to have to correct in the next 25 years. What's more, let's now move on to Group 3, the new member state countries. What we've seen in this group is that the majority of these countries are below the EU average. But what is interesting about this group is that there are two countries, Lithuania and Estonia, that are actually already above the EU average, which just goes to show that very, very quickly things can improve amongst the countries in Group 3. And as a general comment, we'd say in this group, when we talk about higher skilled countries in this group, things are improving in virtually all of those countries. This is a situation that we actually also need to sit in the current context of the financial crisis that we've been going through since 2007-2008, which has led to over 12% unemployment, 26.5 million people unemployed, of which 6 million are youngsters. In fact, between 2008 and 2012, almost 4 million jobs have disappeared in the manufacturing industry in Europe. And the most hardest hit sectors have been sectors such as the construction industry. That's, in fact, the most dramatic case, with a drop in 17%. And the financial sector, which is actually perhaps the origin of this crisis, hasn't lost as much employment as perhaps we would have thought. What can we say about this situation in general? It is true that some countries have been more affected by the crisis than others. The case of Spain is quite clear, but not just Spain. We've got the case of Portugal, Lithuania, and Latvia, which are countries that have been most affected in the sense that they've lost most jobs in the manufacturing sector. But we've also seen that in Germany and in Austria, in these two countries more specifically, the loss of jobs has been far reduced in comparison. This may well be because these countries have, of course, in addition to an interesting economic situation, also VET systems that are very effective. So what we've seen over recent years is massive job destruction, related to a structural lack of skills, or a complete mismatch of skills, more to the point. So there are two things that we need to consider when we talk about employment policies. Firstly, the coming onto the labour market of youngsters and how to get more youngsters onto the job market. And then the second issue of many low-skilled workers that need to be upskilled. The trend, basically, in the European economy is actually really quite clear. We need increasingly skilled workers. And the challenge, if we really want to talk about employment policy challenges, is that youth employment is really our main priority. And what does the EU offer? How can the EU help in all of this? Basically, when we talk about VET, when we talk about active employment policies, this is something that actually the EU doesn't do a great deal about. It's done at a regional and at a national level. That's where efforts need to be concentrated. However, at the same time, the EU can help in some specific areas. And for example, you all know about the Erasmus program because it organizes student mobility around the whole of the EU. But there's additionally to Erasmus, we now have Erasmus Plus. And in Erasmus Plus, vocational training trainers and trainees can also become more mobile. And this is something that I'm sure is of interest to those of you who are out there listening to this talk. In fact, there are calls for applications that are published on the internet, so it's worthwhile keeping an eye open them and seeing what possibilities are out there. So there are also other programs for mobility for youngsters from a cultural viewpoint, youth exchange cultural programs, as well as worker mobility programs, which don't have any age limitations to them. What's more, there are other interesting activities throughout Europe, which include, for example, specific actions. And when I talk about specific actions, I mean agreements, for example, between industrial associations and trade unions, agreements which seek to share best practices or lessons learnt from national observatories on, for example, skills development. There are several events and experiences that are very interesting and can help us draw conclusions from what's been done in different nations. And in fact, this work actually gives rise to a number of reports and the transfer of best practices between different member states. Another interesting issue, if we want to exchange just not policies but also people within the vocational training framework, is that it's very important that we share common terms, and that's what we're working on, to try to define precisely which concepts are used, so that if a person is going to take part in a vocational training activity in another member state, they know what they're going for. There's no sort of mismatch because we've got different terminological problems, or we haven't given the same meaning to one specific word. What we're also seeing, and this is something that's specifically visible in the textile industry, is that there are a series of vocational training institutions, and especially as well academic and university institutes that have disappeared over the last 20 to 25 years. So what we're trying to do is see in the different member states what vocational and training activities that still exist, so that we can perhaps use a module that exists in Belgium and combine it with another one that exists in Spain or the UK, so that we can offer comprehensive training to technicians, engineers. And this is a task that is actually starting out this year, and which I think is going to be interesting. I'm not going to go too much. I'm not going to go on too much about the Apprenticeship Training Alliance, because actually I think yesterday you had a presentation on this matter, but that's another important issue. And finally, at a company policy or business policy level, there's going to be a review of the Small Business Act. What is this Small Business Act? Well, it's a strategic document for SME support policy in Europe. It's been in existence for several years now. And if we consider that next year the Small Business Act is going to be reviewed with the new arrival of the new commission that's just been voted in. Within this framework, it's quite clear that the issue of skills and vocational education and training is going to be one of the priorities. So this kind of conference that's been held for the last 3 years is quite possibly a source of inspiration for feeding into this work of reviewing the Small Business Act. So I strongly advise the organizer of this event to get across the conclusions of this international event, so that they are taken into consideration at a European level within the Small Business Act review. And I've finished on that note. Thank you so much for listening to me. Goodbye.